All right, we're going to tie up a pretty well-known pattern here. This is something you've probably seen quite a bit of. This is going to be the peacock spider. So that's kind of what we're going to end up with at the end of the day. Peacock body, soft hackle feather, a little orange hot spot on there. Really, really effective fly. You can fish it as an emerger, as a nymph, a number of different things. I've used it in weird ways. I've actually had that as my tag fly on a Euro nymph setup, and that's obviously going to sound weird because this fly is going to do a lot of things for you, but one thing it's not going to do is get you down deep. But if I'm fishing in, some relatively, not so much shallow water, but water where I'm not having a problem getting down, I usually throw that on my tag end, and that does pretty well there. All right, so first thing in the vise, got a firehole 316. This is the typical hook that I'll use for this pattern. I like the way that it bends, and it's got a little bit of a shorter shank. Thread-wise, I'm going to use some UTC 70 in white. You can use pretty much anything that you want for thread. Doesn't matter if it's flat or round, as the peacock body is going to cover all that up. I just like the white because it contrasts pretty well on the shank and allows me to see what I'm doing. And I also like the white head that we're going to end up with at the end. So that's why I use white. All right, hotspot-wise, you got a few options for this. I'm going to use this Brite fluorescent floss in orange. You can even just use straight thread if you want to. One of the most popular things to use, which is probably what you'll see if you look up this fly elsewhere, is people using resin. And that's completely fine. Obviously, resin works great. You're more than welcome to use that. The only reason why I'm not going to use resin is because I've invested in some of this stuff. Like here's a container of the Gulf Ambulance in hot fluorescent red. And, I use it, but I don't use it a ton. And if you don't use it all that much, it can coagulate and bind up and basically make it completely useless. I might throw that in the microwave later, see if I can salvage it. But honestly, the floss is a lot cheaper. And I don't know, man. I might even argue I like the look even better. But we'll see. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to keep this nice and tight. And we're going to wrap this with 3 or 4 turns towards the back of the fly until it starts going down the bend of the hook. Then I'm going to double back and wrap it back forward on top of itself. And then I'm going to back towards the back again. And all we're really doing here is just kind of building up that, that football-shaped hot spot that we're shooting for, keeping that nice and tight. And those individual strands will just lay right on top of each other until you get to the point where you can bring this in and get that tied off. And a few wraps to get that locked in will be just fine because we're going to cover that in resin. So trust me, the orange is not going anywhere. So now we want to get our thread away from the hot spot so we can coat it in resin. We also want to clean up our mess and bring our thread to the front of the eye. So just kind of turn and take a bunch of turns towards the front and get that out of there. And we're going to take some of this Solaris Bone Dry. Get a little gob of that on our brush. And you don't need to do anything crazy with this. Just kind of take your brush, bring it down, and just dab your hot spot. And once you dab your hot spot, that resin will sink into the threads, and you can turn your fly and get it. I didn't really get enough on there for the backside, but that'll kind of take its own shape. You don't really need to do much to shape that. And then when you like the way it looks, just come in and zap it with your torch, and that'll cure up nice and solid for you. Now, for me, I'm using this Solaris torch, and I never really worried about my torch. I just figured a torch was a torch, and I had a bunch of UV lights. But I'll tell you, if you're in the market for one of these, they're not cheap. They're not $5 or $10. They're going to cost you a couple bucks. But this Solaris torch is better than anything I have found. I used to have to take my flies and just let them sit in the windowsill in the natural sun to cure them up. But I don't have to do that with this. It cures them up rock solid. Now, I still do that, but I don't have to. That's the big difference. All right, so for the peacock body, you have quite a few options. And if you want to use Hurl, you obviously can use Hurl. For me, I like to use these thin fibers that are close to the eye. So I'm going to take one of my peacock eyes, and I'm going to pull 3 fibers off of the eye. I've always liked these because they're a little bit, they don't have as long of barbs, and it really kind of makes for a nicer looking fly. All right, so what we're going to do, this is where things are going to get a little weird, where I do things a little different, but this is my method of tying in a peacock body. I'm going to take these 3 strands, I'm going to cinch them in there with a few tight turns. Now, I want to make a dubbing loop that is a little bit shorter than the length of these strands of peacock. So all I'm going to do is hold them tight, bring my thread down to where it's equal to that length, shorten it up a little bit, and then bring it back up here and create that loop. And then we'll come back towards the front, get everything all locked in. Now, all I really want to do is I want to twist my dubbing loop and lock in my peacock as I do that. So how I'm going to manage that, see how there's a top piece of thread and a bottom piece of thread? I have that peacock locked in with my finger along the top piece of thread. And I'm going to keep that nice and tight. I just ripped off a strand. Well, let's see what happens. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm 99% sure that those 2 strands will make just as nice a body as I need it to make. But I'll tell you what's really going to bug me is if I got to go back and refilm everything, because it doesn't. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to rip off one more little piece of peacock. And I'm going to come back and just tie that in separately so that we're back at 3. The 2 seconds it took to do that will definitely beat having to go back and refilm everything. But I'm pretty sure those 2 strands would have worked just fine, but why risk it? All right, so what we're going to do is let's get back in here to dubbing loop land here. So I'm going to take those 3 strands, run them along the top piece of thread, and I'm just going to take this basic dubbing twister here. I'm going to go over the top and then under the bottom. And I'm just going to twist my hook here so that I'm grabbing everything, the peacock included. And I know that's hard to see on the camera, but honestly, once you do this yourself, you'll kind of see what I mean. How you have to make sure that you grab all of it. So you shouldn't have any trouble with this at all. All right, and once you get all that locked in, now we're just going to start twisting and get that peacock kind of locked into your dubbing loop. Now you don't want to twist too much. See how the top part is still a little loose? That's fine. If you twist too much, peacock is pretty delicate, which is the whole reason why we're doing this to begin with. So if you do too much, you will break some strands. But once you get that to where everything is kind of rock solid, now you can take your tool and just start wrapping your body. And the cool thing about this technique is you're going to get an absolute rock solid peacock body. You're not going to be able to break this. You're not going to be able to affect this at all. I'm just trying to cover up that one spot that for some reason wants to show some thread. But this is a much stronger way to wrap peacock. You definitely don't need glue or anything, which I know I'm gonna get beat up in the comments for not using glue. I always do. But glue is not going to raise your durability, and it's not going to be stronger than this. I mean, I will hand it to you. It is easier. So if you want to drop some glue in there and do it that way, have at it. But I just wrap mine in a dubbing loop, no glue. And you're going to get yourself a rock solid peacock body there. Okay, so there's that. Kind of just stroke those back a little. Next order of business is your hackle. I have a really, really small piece of partridge here that I've ripped off the one side of the feathers. And the reason why I did that is I just really want this to be sparse. So I'm just going to kind of pull those fibers back and create a tie-in point. Set that right on there. I also like to have really, really neat heads on my soft hackles. So notice how I'm running this right up to the eye. And that's not going to cause me any problems at all. I see a lot of these people leave a lot of room at the head. And that's fine, but I go all the way up to the eye for a specific reason. And I'll kind of show you what happens once I'm done wrapping this. Where are my hackle pliers? I'm going to take these English hackle pliers. I'm going to get that cinched onto there. I'm going to orient the feathers the way that I want them to lay. And I'm just going to do one wrap and about a half of a second wrap. And then I'm going to come in and tie that off. I want this to be particularly sparse, so I'm not going to go too crazy with this. And before I go any further, I'm going to cut that right off because I don't want to catch a bunch of stray fibers that aren't wrapped around my hook. We'll take all of that, we'll stroke it back. Make sure you get every fiber. Take a few wraps, and we'll whip finish it. And there's that white head that I kind of like to accomplish. Okay, so you want to make sure that these fibers are separated. Sometimes partridge can kind of clump up a little bit. So just kind of stroke those out, make sure that they're all separated. And then we'll hold everything back and just come in here with a little dab of resin just to brighten up that head a little bit. Give that a little zap with the torch. And you're good to go. Close everything up here. So that is your peacock spider, orange hotspot. Really effective fly. Now, this is what I would use in a river, and because of that, I know I have a little bit of that resin that caught the bottom end of those fibers, and that's going to keep everything stroked back like that. But that's kind of the look that I want. If you're fishing this in a still water and you're a fan of movement on your flies, you can do things a little different. Just make sure you don't get any resin on the base of those fibers. Like this one here, those ones splay out a little bit more. So that's kind of what you're going to end up with. But it's a great fly, really effective, pretty easy to tie. If you don't want to do the dubbing loop for the peacock, you can just wrap it normal with some glue, or you can run a wire rib through it. That'll work too. I prefer the dubbing loop because I've used that for quite a while, and I'll tell you, absolutely rock solid. I don't think I've ever had a peacock body come apart. I've had wire wrap bodies come apart. I've had, using super glue, I've had those bodies come apart, but never with a dubbing loop. So that's how I do all my peacock bodies. So that is pretty much it. Any questions or anything, just leave them right in the comments. Or if you want to rip me for not using glue, you can leave those in the comments too. We'll have at it. Either way, tie it up. Really great fly. Hope the video helps.